Good morning. Today is the 25th day of Elul, the 11th of September. The 25th day of Elul is the day of creation, according to Rabbi Yoshua, who says that creation was in Tishrei, and Rosh Hashanah is actually the sixth day of creation, the day on which man was created. And so if we go back 5 days, we get to the 25th of Elul, which is the first day of creation. And there is a custom even to read the reading of the first day of creation. Today it's 5 verses. When you have time, it's probably a good idea to go over them. We're now holding by the second reading of Ha'azinu. And Ha'azinu is mostly the song that Moses composed just before his death, and we saw this last week. Vayichtov Moshe et Hashira. Moses wrote the song, and this is the song. So the readings are very short, but they're also very, very laden with meaning. So I'm not even going to try to read everything in the translation of the reading, even though it's short, because when you open it up, it becomes very long when you try to explain what the words mean, because this is poetry. And poetry is always much heavier with meaning than prose is. So what I want to focus on is the 8th and 9th verses, verses 8 and 9. So we're in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. And I'll read it from the Vishnevsky translation, which has Rashi already intercalated into it. Consider how God loves his chosen people. When he, the Supreme One, gave the nations their inheritance after the flood, and when he divided the descendants of Adam after the Tower of Babel into separate nations, he did not destroy them on account of their misdeeds. Rather, he firmly established the boundaries of peoples according to the number of the descendants of Israel who descended to Egypt, that is, 70 nations. He did this because God's portion, that is, his people, the Israelites, was latent in these nations, meaning hidden. The Israelites are his chosen people by virtue of being descendants of Jacob, who is the rope of his inheritance. Just as a rope is made up of 3 intertwining cords, so did Jacob internalize a threefold merit, that of his grandfather Abraham, that of his father Isaac, and his own merit. Ishmael and Esau, in contrast, did not possess this threefold merit. So there's a lot of stuff here, and this is the basis for a lot of thinking in Jewish thought about history, about geography, about culture, about, in the last 200 years, this concept of nationalism. Nationalism has fallen out of favor, so there's almost no point in talking about it anymore. But you can't ignore it, because we're still in the final throes, one might say, of the nationalistic attitude. Maybe one of the only places in the world that nationalism, the notion of a nation state, still causes a lot of trouble and controversy is probably in the land of Israel, with the Arabs that want self-determination as a separate nation, and they're trying to bring up all kinds of bygone theories of what nationalism is and so on. And I think that a lot of people don't even know what in the world they're talking about anymore. They were slow to pick up on the idea, and I think that it's not exactly something that people understand. So it's very contentious. But let me say a word about it so that there's this understanding. We've met this concept of there being 70 languages before. We actually met it twice in the book of Deuteronomy, if you remember, that when Moses first began to explain the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, we said, Ba'er, he explained it, and Rashi says they're in 70 languages. And again, on the second set of stones that they set up, the boulders that they set up after coming out of the Jordan River, they wrote apparently some part of the Torah in 70 languages, translating it into 70 languages. And the way we understood this was that there is a connection, an inherent connection between the language of the Torah, what we call the holy language. People call it Hebrew, but Hebrew is not the holy language per se. There were other nations that spoke Hebrew or a variant of Hebrew. The idea is that the holy language is language of prophecy, specifically the prophecy of Moses. And from that, the rest of the prophets took, either directly as something that is very close to the Hebrew, again, the holy language that Moses spoke, or not as close to it, but with minor variations in some of the later prophets, and certain changes of the usage of roots and so on. The idea being that language is really what defines people. Now, this is a very, very important switch from the picture of nationalism, of nation states, that was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, the 18th and 19th centuries saw tremendous changes in the way that scholars looked at the makeup of humanity. And I can't get into this now. This is it's really a deep and wide field of inquiry. But I have to mention two of these thinkers. The one was Giambattista Vico from Italy, and the other was Herder from Germany. And they pretty much set up the whole concept of what people understood as nation states, or nations in general, or cultures that are linked to nations in the 18th and 19th centuries. This led, of course, in the Jewish people to a lot of speculation about this. There was a very influential book that was written in Germany in the latter part of the 19th century called The Psychology of Nations. And it was just the Jewish version, taking the Bible and analyzing it that way, trying to get at what might be the psychology of nations, which raises a lot of questions, because how could you compare the nations of 3,300 years ago, at least 3,300 years ago, to the nations that exist today? What exactly is the connection? There's no connection that we know of. There's no link between the two. The Assyrian Empire is gone. The Babylonian Empire is gone. The Greek Empire is gone. They may have the same name, but they don't even speak the same language. This led to a lot of interesting theories about how to look at the world, and how, in some sense, would this connect with the Jewish people in some way. Because what are these verses saying? They're saying that there's some kind of parallel, some kind of correspondence between the 70 families of Jacob that went down to Egypt and the 70 nations of the world. And then you have to start thinking, what does this exactly mean? So I'm going to put aside all this national inquiry, which I said both is out of favor today, and also doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of how would you historically tie people today with people from 3,000 years ago, and instead go on the basic definition here. And the basic definition is that he's saying that when the dispersion from the Tower of Babel happened, instead of punishing the people, he set up barriers between them. And what were the barriers? The languages. The languages became the barriers, and this is a tremendous insight into what makes humans into humans. So we know that whenever we discuss the levels of life, or the levels of the appearance of godliness in reality, we speak about 4 levels. Usually 4 levels are called the inanimate, the vegetable, the animal, the animate, and the speaker. We don't say the thinker, we say the speaker. Why do we not say the thinker? A human being is a thinker. Well, in the same way that you can understand the animal by looking at its anima, by looking at how it acts, how it moves around. What are its, meaning when I would come to study zoology, what I would be most interested in is the actions of an animal. When I come to study vegetables, meaning botany, or the study of plants, I would be interested in how they grow, the vegetable, the tzomech it's called in Hebrew, their growth is what interests me. When I look at the inanimate, I'm looking at the unanimated part of this thing, the thing that doesn't change, the static nature of an element, of a compound, of a rock, whatever. When I come to think about human beings, what I should be most interested in, this says, is not their thought, but rather their language. Because in effect, the thought rests upon language the same way that the animal rests upon its physical abilities. In other words, what we're saying is that language is the basis. It's almost like the body to which the thought is connected. Without language, there is no thought. It's a very basic concept in human thought, that without any kind of language, you can't really think. And so if I want to catalog, if I want to understand the different types of opinions that people have, in the end, what I'm looking at is the languages that they're speaking. So for instance, today, the German-speaking countries, those are usually Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So they have a shared pattern of thought because of their language, not because of their culture. That's the idea here. That the culture is created by the language. The language is a substrate upon which and from which the thought grows. And so, in the same sense, the whole idea here is that Hebrew, not Hebrew per se, but the holy language can be translated into all these languages in the sense that there is a kernel of this type of thinking within the language of the Torah. There is some kind of basis like that. Now, we don't have time now to go over the different theories that divide or try to divide the language of the Torah into 70 different modes. But let's just mention the very, very basic statement that I think anyone who studied any Torah knows, that there are 70 faces to the Torah. And what we mean by 70 faces is that the language itself lends itself to 70 different types of interpretation. In other words, what we're saying is that the language of the prophecy of Moses is like the collective substrate of all human knowledge. And it can be that because in the end, knowledge and culture and everything else that we call human originates from language. And the idea here is that all the languages in the end connect in some way or are represented in some way in the language of the Torah. Now this is a tremendous, I've never seen anybody write a book which tries to connect languages with modes of thinking in Torah, but this is basically what these verses are saying. If I can say just another word before we need to end, the notion that language precedes thought is one that one of the best ways to see it is in psychology. We usually say that if a person doesn't have a language, he doesn't have words to describe what they feel, then they can't come to terms with it. They have no way to process it. So you have many people walking around in the world analphabetical in a certain sense. They're illiterate to themselves because they have no language to carry their own self. And the idea here is that you need to have language. You have to have a deep and rich and wide language in order to develop the human experience. And without that, you remain not just crude, but also, and this is more troubling, you remain without any means to actually help yourself. You become unknown to yourself. You have no way of relating to yourself. And when you have no way to relate to yourself, you certainly have no way to relate to others. One more statement, and we'll finish with this. The idea that all languages in the end originate from the language of the Torah, again, is not necessarily a historical idea, even though the Torah says that the language that they spoke before the Tower of Babel was some kind of variant of the holy language. Whether that's true or not, I don't think it matters. I don't know if it's telling us a historical fact. It never mentions that in the Torah itself. It's not explicitly said. It just said that everyone had one tongue. And what they mean by one tongue is that they were of one mind. And that's one of the basic sources for this connection between language that begets thought, that begets a direction in life. So even though this is not stated per se, it's not explicit in the Torah, what it does give us is a very important, I'd call it like a map for understanding that humanity is one. It's one of these basic ideas. If you're following the morning classes, we're talking about this a lot now. What did the unity of God mean in Abraham's time when there was no yet Torah per se? He had maybe parts of it, but he didn't know the Torah as we know it. So what did idolatry represent then? And we've talked about this about the Roman Empire, that you have to emerge from a state of pantheism, of idolatry. In the past, that meant getting over the seeming separation of power, separation of physical processes in nature, and seeing the unity in it. And in our times, getting over idolatry to a large degree means being able to unite the different modes of thought of human beings, and being able to see how in the end we are really one unit, really in the end. But to be able to do that, you have to translate. You have to learn how to translate from one mode of thought to another mode of thought. In fact, this is said clearly in many Hasidic tales, that when you come to talk to someone else, when you try to get an idea across, then you have to understand that your consciousness is in your mouth, and when you pray for divine providence, when you come to talk to someone else, what you're praying is for your words to be heard, meaning for your words to be translated from your mode of thinking to their mode of thinking. This is obviously very clear if you speak two different languages, but it's just the same if you have two different opinions, two different thoughts about the world, two different conceptual schemes of the world, and so on. And this is really the challenge of our generation. This is really what it means that the Mashiach needs to come. The Mashiach coming means to create these bridges, being able to translate from one mode of thought to another. And to do that, the understanding from these verses is that you have to go back to the language of the Torah. You have to see how the Torah represents these 70 different faces, these 70 different modes of thought within itself. So I understand that these are very deep things, kind of heavy for the morning, but this song of Ha'azinu is just tremendous, and it includes so many wonderful ideas. I hope we get to speak about it some more, and hope to see you tomorrow.